that. Just keep that in mind. So my intention today is to teach you about brain region function. And in doing this, I'm going to flip back and forth, or at least I'm going to attempt to flip back and forth between the diagrams that you have in Workbook 2, which is now up on Canvas and is due on Friday. So I'm going to help you through some of that. I'm not going to help you through all of it, but I'm going to help you through a great portion of that. So we will begin with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the primary motor area, especially in charge of skeletal muscles. So this is what's going to help you move and keep you coordinated. And for some weird reason, this is the way this is working today. So I'm going to color the frontal lobe. I'm just going to outline it actually. So frontal lobe. As I said, I'm not going to cover all of these areas. So this is your primary motor area. I imagine that this will be very annoying. Second part is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe sits behind the frontal lobe, and it is the primary sensory area, especially the special senses. So we have 5 senses that we recognize, although there is a 6th sense that used to be determined to be ESP, but now, there's another definition for it. But our 5 senses include smelling, tasting, hearing, sight, and touch. So the parietal lobe is in charge of the special senses. So that would be those first 4: seeing, hearing, tasting, and smelling. As I said, the parietal lobe sits behind. One of these days I'll master this. Sits behind the frontal lobe. So this is this area. I went too far. Getting into your temporal lobe, which is the next lobe we're going to talk about. So that green is the parietal lobe. So the next lobe is the temporal lobe. As you might imagine, this is near your temples. And this is in charge of auditory responses. And auditory responses means not just understanding what you're hearing, but also understanding what you're saying. So it's in charge of understanding what's the information that's coming in, but also understanding what you're putting out. So this is very important in language. So we'll make this one pink. Like I said, it's over your temple, extends back this way. And if you take a look in your textbook, you will see the different areas of it that are in charge of speech and in charge of understanding language. The final major lobe of the brain is the occipital lobe, which is located at the back of your head. And when we talk about bones, we'll see it is covered by the occipital bone. So if you feel the back of your head, there's like a notch, that's your occipital bone. And underneath that is the occipital lobe. Sorry, my cat just jumped on the piano. The occipital lobe is in charge of visual information. And in the next chapter, we will be talking about, once again, we're going to be talking about those special senses. So, where's the occipital lobe? There it is, way over at 11. Okay. Here is the occipital lobe. When we talk about the special senses, we will talk about how what you're actually seeing, you're seeing it upside down, but your brain turns it right side up for you. So a little fun stuff to come in the future. Some other major brain regions, if we're going to go down into getting near the brainstem, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a wrinkly portion of your brain that is near the posterior region of your brain. And it's in charge of physical balance and equilibrium. So we talked about how your proprioceptors help you to determine where your body is at any given point. But they aren't the only ones that help. And so the cerebellum also helps with this. My goodness, I need a different color. Oh, that's a good color. Cerebellum. Okay, so this is this wrinkly portion down here. So it's going to help determine, once again, where your body is in relation to your environment. The medulla. The medulla is the brainstem. Sorry, I had to let my dog in. The medulla regulates visceral activities. So viscera refers to your internal organs. So the medulla helps regulate things like heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, and swallowing. So in this diagram, this would be what's labeled H. So I'm just outlining it. So all this information is coming from your spinal cord, and your medulla helps you to, it helps the brain to not have to do as much. Reduces brain function in that, hey, I can help with this and I can send messages back through the spinal cord. When it comes to those visceral activities. So the brain can concentrate on other things. Just above the medulla is the pons. The pons also helps control breathing. And once again, the pons is found at a spot where, hey, we cannot take this to the brain. The brain doesn't have to worry about it. We'll worry about it. And so the pons is what's labeled G here. Sorry, I haven't been very good about labeling those dots up there. All right. So that's the external portion of the brain. Once we get inside, this is where the diagram is going to become a little bit more complex. So we're going to switch to page 2 of the diagram. And we'll start with the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain. And if any of you have taken or are taking psychology, you might have heard about the man who had the rod that got shoved up through his brain and it severed his corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is right about here, and it connects the two sides of the brain. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus we'll talk about again next chapter when we're talking about the endocrine system, but the main job of the hypothalamus is to regulate temperature, water, and to help regulate metabolism. So the way I've always looked at this, and maybe it's just my weird brain, is that this area kind of looks like the United States. And down here where Florida would be, that's the hypothalamus. And you'll notice it's very close to what F and E are, and especially F is going to be very, so they don't have a label line on it, but that is the hypothalamus. Very important. And like I said, we'll talk more about that next chapter. The thalamus. The thalamus is a relay for sensory information. And it interprets if the sense coming in is positive or negative. Is this a good sensation or a bad sensation? And so if we look at our little map of the United States here, the rest of the United States, not including that little tail of Florida, is the thalamus. And once again, this is something, the thalamus we will talk about again next chapter. But it regulates and it considers whether impulses are good or bad. Judgment. It's the judgment. Pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system. So since that's the next chapter we're talking about, we'll talk more about the pituitary gland in the next chapter. And the pituitary gland is this gland that hangs off of the hypothalamus. So labeled F in this diagram. And that's going to be really important when we talk about the function of the hypothalamus and the function of the pituitary gland. That's going to be very important. But for now, it's just important that it is part of the endocrine system. Pineal body is also part of the endocrine system. This is also called the pineal gland. And so for now, all we're going to say is this is part of the endocrine system. Okay, so the pineal body is labeled N on this particular diagram. And once again, we'll talk about that. That's a fun one. That's your third eye. And we'll talk about that in the endocrine system. The mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies are in charge of olfactory reflex. Olfactory being your smell, your sense of smell. So reflexes. And it's in charge of memory, recollective memory. And once again, in the next chapter, we'll talk a little bit about this. Because obviously we're going to be talking about what's going on there in your olfactory neurons. So this is just this little body that goes down to the cerebellum. We will talk about how your olfactory sensation is actually your strongest memory sense. And we'll talk about why that is. Our next on our list is the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is in charge of making cerebrospinal fluid. So we mentioned that the cerebrospinal fluid circulates around, cushions your brain and spinal cord. Your choroid plexus, you have a couple of them actually. Sorry, I'm running out of colors here. Is this kind of fuzzy stuff? Right here. That's one of the places where it's found. There's also some more found like down here. My iPad sounds like it's about to blow up. This is scaring me a little bit. All right, so it forms the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is found in ventricles. So the third ventricle, and ventricles are just open spaces, and we'll talk about ventricles of the heart, and that's what they are. They're open spaces. So there's a third ventricle and a fourth ventricle. The third ventricle is found next to the thalamus. And the fourth ventricle is found between the cerebellum and the pons. So if we go on our diagrams, maybe. And we're looking at these ventricles. So next to, I don't know if you can see this coloring here. Yeah, it's a little bit. And then in between. So third ventricle is up here. Fourth ventricle is between the cerebellum and the pons. All right, we're almost done. The corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina is in charge of vision and hearing reflexes. And the final part of the brain, as far as the gross anatomy of the brain, is the optic chiasma. This is a relay or crossover for visual information from each eye. So that's how we're taking in information from each eye, and at some point it has to cross over, it has to flip over, and then it goes to the occipital lobe, where the occipital lobe is like, hey, this is what we're really seeing. The world is not upside down and backwards. All right, ladies, that concludes our venture into the brain. I hope it was not too painful, and I hope that these notes were a little bit helpful. We can kind of review them next week on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, we will talk about cranial nerves and move on from there. Have a great weekend or week or whatever, whenever you're listening to this. I hope you're listening to it sooner rather than later. Watch Canvas.